Let's talk a little bit about how your paths originally crossed with Bob Dole.
I was working in New York City for a nursing association and working as a nurse. And in the course of that, it was a student association, began to spend time in Washington doing government affairs, student loan issues, nursing student program. And in the course of that, came to know people at the Senate Finance Committee. And that was over a couple of years period of time. And I had made a decision at that point to go back home to California and was beginning to think about that transition out of New York. And one of the staff in the Finance Committee said to me, how about Washington and how about Bob Dole? He's looking for someone to do health issues for him. At the time, he was a relatively junior member of the Senate Finance Committee.
Was this before 76?
This was in 1977.
Okay.
And
so he had a national reputation.
He had a national reputation, but not one particularly on the Hill per se, and not one in health policy at all. And he was going to become and was the ranking Republican on the Finance Committee Health Subcommittee. Herman Talmadge was the chairman. And the committee had only recently developed a partisan or staff that was divided between Democrats and Republicans. It had really until quite recently, prior to that time, been a single staff. But the Republicans had decided that they needed an independent staff and began to do so. And the Democrats had on their staff a physician. And health policy was becoming a big issue. It was during Carter's term of office. Hospital cost containment was a major issue, cost controls. And Dole made a decision he wanted someone on the staff to be actively involved in health issues. And so the Finance Committee staff member suggested that he interview me. Suggested to me I interview with Bob Dole. I, of course, had no idea who Bob Dole was to any extent at all. I was a liberal Democrat, born and raised in California, and no exposure really to the Midwest, and certainly not to Republican politics or to Bob Dole.
But now, obviously, you know him.
Yeah, exactly.
Presumably had.
I didn't really know of him.
Some baggage from that campaign.
It wasn't. I wasn't terribly involved. I mean, like everyone else, I voted, but I didn't follow it terribly closely. I wasn't really active politically, except in healthcare issues. Not as a partisan political matter. And interestingly enough, I said, well, it'll be interesting. And so I came down for an interview with Dole. I will never forget it. I was in his office in the Dirksen building, and it was relatively dark. The room was relatively dark. And he was, matter of fact, relatively short, as he's wont to do, certainly at that point in time. And, we sort of talked back and forth. It was a relatively short conversation, and I said, I'm a liberal Democrat, sort of born and raised. And I'll never forget at the time, his comment was, I really don't care what your politics were as much as I care about the fact you've taken care of patients. And you've had direct contact, and I think we need people looking at health issues who have had that kind of experience. And it was really on that basis I thought it would be an interesting thing to do for a year. And he made a decision that, he spoke with some other people, the Finance Committee staff, and Ken Benjamin, who was on his staff at the time and handling some of the health issues, spoke with Ken. Ken had spoken to me as well. Mary Wheat, who was also a member of his staff at the time, who was handling health issues and doing legislative correspondence and things of that nature, and made a decision that, I would be interesting, and I made a decision that it would be an interesting thing to do for a year. And that was it.
Now, how did the Finance Committee staff at that point relate to the personal staff? Because it was always a bit of a...
And always was, never changed. The personal staff was personal staff, and the committee were the committee. And there was a clear division, and there was a...
Were there loyalty tests of...
Interesting. The Finance Committee is unusual in the fact that the committee staff answers solely to the chairman. and to the ranking in this case. And the members of the committee had no hiring rights. So Dole, even as a subcommittee ranking, had no authority to hire on the finance committee staff. His staff were simply personal staff, and we had to figure out a way to work with the committee to achieve whatever in my case, Bob Dole wanted to get done. But the staff answered to, at that time, Carl Curtis and Herman Talmadge, or Russell Long, who was the full chairman. And the staffs of the committee really, saw themselves answering up. And I was in constant negotiations with Dave Swope, who was the Republican staff member at the time on the committee, as Dole's representative. And so it's always been a tenuous relationship and somewhat tension-filled, because you want to represent your particular boss, and the staff of the committee represented the committee. And so it was my earliest introduction to negotiation on the part of an individual member in concert with the committee. And so, that's always been an interesting relationship. I was lucky. I knew the majority staff very well. Jim Mongan, Jay Constantine, John Kern, Bob Hoyer, all were Democratic staff members who had introduced me to Dole and who were enormously important in the doings of the committee. And I suspect they cut me a lot of slack and helped me help Dole to move, as part of the committee. Dave Swope was the Republican staff member. And again, there was this tension between what the committee wanted and what the members wanted.
So did you graduate, when Dole moved up the ladder and became chairman?
Well, what was interesting was within 6 months, an unusual thing occurred. Dole was relatively junior. There were at least two people ahead of him, Cliff Hansen and Carl Curtis, both of whom made a decision to retire. And that is what moved Dole up to become the ranking of the full committee at the time, much to everyone's surprise. There was no reason to think that, they wouldn't have been there for a long time and that Dole wouldn't have been a junior member for a long time. But they both retired, and I don't recall who else was sort of in the lineup at the time, but Dole was the next one in line who didn't already have a ranking position. And he moved up in that following January. I joined the staff the Memorial Day weekend of 1977. In January of 78, Dole became the ranking. And in the fall, therefore, of 77, he began to build a staff and made a decision to hire Bob Lighthizer as the staff director, Rod DeArmond as the deputy. They, in turn, then began interviewing to hire, and I interviewed to hire to go to the full committee.
Because those are pretty impressive people.
Very.
How did Dole find them?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I know the answer to that question. They were both at Covington and Burling, both young lawyers, both with individual expertise. Bob's in trade, Rod's in law, or in tax, rather. Bob also, had a fairly broad perspective. And I don't know who it is that'll be an interesting question to ask Bob and Rod, how they got to Dole, because I don't think either of them had any history with Dole. But Dole clearly wanted a strong staff. And I must say, in retrospect, not in my interest, but Dole was known for, and I think to this day, known for having one of the strongest finance committee staffs. And I think it was the quality of that leadership, the decision on Bob, the decision on Rod, and they in turn then hired up.
How much of that do you think was influenced by the assumption, which I assume was there, that he was interested in running in 1980?
I suspect it had a lot to do with that. He wanted to begin to build a very fulsome policy staff, and there was no question that those issues were going to be issues that were critical. His decision to be on the finance committee, in addition to ag, ag would have been natural, given his constituency, but finance is one of the big committees, and it's a big committee for a lot of reasons, and it had to do with trade, it had to do with tax, it had to do with social welfare policy. It was one of the plums in terms of broader perspective, and so I think the quality of the staff clearly would position him to begin substantively to engage on very important issues.
Generalizations obviously are dangerous, but looking back, do you think there are basic qualities that he looked for in people? Beyond the specific expertise of a given subject
Right.
matter. Is there such a thing as a prototypical Dole staffer? Or?
Probably not. I mean, if you think back over at least the 20 years I was with him, I mean, there are high points and midpoints in terms of staff skills. I think quality of mind. Certainly he wanted people who were bright, who were well thought of, who were inquisitive. I think he wanted people who were strong, who were prepared to play a leadership role in terms of getting things done, you know, who were, I don't want to say aggressive in the negative sense, but people who clearly were ready to take charge. He didn't want a bunch of staff who were, you know, sort of going to be led by somebody else. He wanted people who were going to be very strong advocates for him and for the policies and the issues he cared deeply about. I think he...
Work ethic?
I think work ethic. I mean, the number of times he would walk in the door and say, you know, you could shoot a cannon through here and not hit a soul, and that was probably on a Saturday morning. You know, he was a guy who was there, and there always, there early. You know, does anybody in here read a newspaper? You know, a classic Dole line, what's new, what's up, you know, what's cooking, wandering desk to desk, expecting you to be on top of whatever it was, and you had a list of, you know, the 6 things you were going to say when he asked what's cooking. So he wanted people that were aggressive, that were engaged, that were energetic, and were tough.
Obviously, without naming names, were there people who fell by the wayside?
Absolutely.
Along the way?
A staff?
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
And
absolutely.
What would account for that?
Well, you know, it's interesting. I mean, I think there's a different perspective on the personal staff to the committee staff, and most of my time was committee staff and leadership. I only spent 5 or 6 months on the personal staff. You know, I think it was... you know, whether he felt he could trust you, whether he was comfortable with your judgment. I think he looked to other people for reinforcement in terms of people's opinion of people. You know, did other people respect your judgment? Did other people respond well? I think he appreciated strength and didn't particularly tolerate or appreciate weakness. I mean, if you kind of folded under the pressure, either of his inquiry or the pressure of just the issues or the time or the demanding, the demands of the time. I mean, you were expected to be there full-time, all the time, always available. And
how did that affect, you know, the number of women around? I mean, strong women.
Well, there weren't many to start with on the finance committee staff, and you know, you knew the kind of job that it was, and I don't think he ever had a reluctance to deal with a woman because she was a woman. I think it was a question, did he see you as a strong personality with a strong point of view? I mean, I think the transition when I became chief of staff in the majority leader's office, the transition from Rod DeArmond to myself, I think Dole at the time really wondered, will people feel that she is strong enough? And it wasn't about she, it was about the person. And I think he, came to be comfortable with that and came to feel that people did respect me. But his concern was, will other people treat this person seriously? And if he saw people not responding, people not taking direction, people not seeing you as a spokesperson in his behalf, or if he was at all concerned about whose agenda was in the forefront, you know, he was very sensitive, as he should have been, as to whether we were representing him or our view of what it should have been. And there was nothing, I mean, in my view as the staff director, I think Rod held the same view, I think Bob held the same view, was the first test was, you know, who you working for, who's in charge. And I remember, you know, questions about, you know, whether people were misleading Dole or, you know, sort of representing Dole. There was never a question in any of our minds as to who was in charge. And when there was, they were not likely someone who will do well, if anyone misrepresented him.
So he was more observant.
Oh, absolutely.
Than perhaps people suspected at the time.
There was no question that he always knew what was going on and was always 2 steps ahead. You know, we all like to think that we had news, you know, that, you know, here's today's update. Chances were he knew 2 days before you did, but didn't necessarily tell you that. I mean, was waiting for, to see whether or not we were catching up, but he was extraordinarily observant. I mean, no question in my mind.
Was the job of AA just an impossible job?
Yes. I mean, I don't think anybody survived very long. It's an interesting question because there was much more longevity on the Finance Committee staff. And I don't know whether that was because there was a little distance and we weren't there every day.
But also, something there, you're dealing with, and in fact, you're judged by your expertise in particular areas.
Subject matters, right.
Whereas the AA
is
has this
thankless,
huge,
amorphous sort of, managing Kansas, and not, as he became much more senior and much more engaged as a Finance Committee chairman, as the majority leader, that's where the focus was. It was on what was going on there on a day-to-day basis, and that's where all the sort of real battles took place. And for the AA, I'm sure, in terms of his attention, it was clearly, it was always on Kansas. There was never any question about that. But we clearly consumed a lot of his time, as the committee or as the leadership. And, the AA had this sort of, managed the sort of mundane, if you could describe it as that, sort of day-to-day, dealing with things, that I'm sure was terribly frustrating.
Didn't the AA also have, in some ways, an extra burden because of Joanne and Betty? I mean, in the sense that their role was so specialized and
it was
entrenched, particularly Joanne.
And because he, for a lot of reasons that were quite understandable, had enormous trust and faith in their judgment, in their relationship. And so things that you might in other offices find fall to the AA in terms of judgment calls and maintaining relationships in the state and being the principal contact of politically for state and for other issues. He had in Joanne someone who played that role and had been with him since the Dolls for Dole days. And it's hard to ever overcome that. And so from an AA's perspective, you were never really the principal in that respect. Very difficult, no question.
Talk about the role Joanne played in Bob Dole's.
Boy, she knew him as well and better than any of us. And I think he had in her someone who had seen him at all points in his political life and had a reality that none of us could have ever achieved as many years as we all spent. None of them were ever going to be as long as Joanne. I think he had absolute faith in her loyalty. I think had an absolute faith in her judgment about political matters, and she was fearsome as a lion at the door. And
I think he admired her toughness.
Absolutely, absolutely, and her absolute loyalty, and her not protection, but her sensitivity to him. I think at times it got in the way. I think there were times where people found that off-putting. There were times...
Was she ever hurt?
I'm sure she was. I'm sure there were things in her life or relationship with him that were disappointing at times. I don't know that any of us are really privy to that. But
focusing so much of your life.
Well, on one person and
right.
on his goals and aspirations, but those are decisions that people make in their life in terms of how they're going to spend their time, and we all sort of make those decisions. But she clearly, her life was Bob Dole 24/7, more than any of us, and there were great rewards in that. But there were also, I'm sure, terrible challenges in terms of how you balance the rest of your life. And, when things go well, they go well. When they go badly, they go really badly. And so you suffer the ups and you really suffer the downs.
If she bore the brunt of the down periods.
She certainly saw it far more than many of us. And I'm sure there were days that were remarkably dark because she had put so much of herself into the political side of his life, and didn't, in some respects, interestingly enough, I mean, all of us were committed to him politically, but we also had the benefit of the sort of policy successes. I mean, did you lose the election? Yes, but what did you achieve in Social Security? What did you achieve in welfare reform? What did you achieve in food stamps? What did you achieve in Medicare? When the large part of your life is the political side, you get a little less of that sort of positive reinforcement by having achieved some of these outcomes. And so she had, not that she wasn't proud of him, she was, but it was a little less personal. I mean, I felt good when we did the hospice benefit. Okay, well, it came after, a presidential, sort of race that didn't go well. But, I was looking at, what did we achieve in, bailing out Social Security?
Sure.
It's a different, you have a little bit of a difference in terms of reality.
How early on did you, if you did, sense a discrepancy between sort of the public image of Dole and the reality? I mean, as long as I've known him, people have been coming up and saying, we didn't know he was funny. I mean, that's just the most obvious.
Right.
But I mean, there was that period clearly in the mid-'80s,
yes,
early '80s, when he began to demonstrate a capacity for responsible leadership.
Yes.
So in a kind of a professional way, people began to reassess the old gunslinger, from the Nixon days.
Yes.
But beyond and beneath that professional level, the man himself, I mean, did you sense complexities?
Certainly not at first. It was probably into the Finance Committee days when I began to have a better sense of that, and it was because I had more exposure to him. You needed that to really see the sort of depth. I mean, the sort of, rumbling around desk to desk. You got one vision. Sitting down in, the back room with Bob Dole and Danny Rostenkowski.
What was that like?
Entertaining. Unbelievably frank, or a conversation with Herman Talmadge or Russell Long. I mean, I look back and I am blessed with having been there at a time when there were giants, Abe Rubakoff, Herman Talmadge, I mean, just, Russell Long, Jack Hines, John Chafee, I mean, just remarkable human beings.
Pat Moynihan. How did Long run his committee?
Oh, boy.
And the relationship with Dole and how that evolved over time.
I'll never forget the Dole being called by Howard Baker and told that he was going to be the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, and Dole's reaction was, well, who's going to tell Russell? And when the vote occurred in the committee, and they called Mr. Chairman, and Long voted. And sort of said, not only am I voting, for my chairman, I'm voting, it was sort of a, I'm voting for my chairman. I think their relationship was quite good. I think because they were both consummate politicians, but at the end of the day, they were also consummate legislators. They were both people who you would present them with an issue, and the question was, how did you resolve the question? Not how can we pit ourselves against one another. And, Long was unbelievably wily, and you always worried when Long came up to your boss and put his arm around his neck and whispered in his ear, because you never really knew what was going to happen. And that was Long's style. And it was, I'm trying to remember now the sort of quote. It was something about, never call, I'm now forgetting what the quote is, but it is, sort of never, talk when you can whisper, never whisper when you can wink. I mean, the sort of, sort of very personal connection. Similarly with Moynihan. enormous respect for one another as legislators. The same with George Mitchell, both at the Finance Committee as well as leader. These were people, Robert C. Byrd, another one, who they had enormous respect for each other. And it's because at the end of the day, they were interested in solving problems.
That raises, we're jumping ahead here, but it does raise a very large issue that sort of haunts Dole's years at the top of the national political scene. Is there a conflict between wanting to be a successful legislator and running for president?
I think it's very hard. I think it's hard in a number of respects. One, I think being in office and running, you're at risk of having been held accountable for every vote you ever had. How many times did we hear that Dole voted against Medicare? How many years later? And so you have your history, and the longer the history, the longer the need for explanation. But I think it also is challenging because, the instinct is to, on the one hand, on the other hand, when you're running for something, so that you can get the broadest possible support without alienating, unless it is so bright line, sort of a decision. It's very difficult to, sort of just come down hard and know you're not going to, sort of make somebody unhappy. As a legislator, what you want to do is stand in the well and have everybody come and say, all right, now let's figure out who, how are we going to get this done, and with whom are we going to deal, and what's the trade-off going to be. And I think, I know the campaign, particularly in '96, their great anxiety was the fact that Dole was still leader and still having to do these deals. And everybody was going to take the opportunity to say, here he goes, and get squishy on us. Certainly the conservatives were, always were a little suspicious that the guy was too quick to come to, whether it was Tefra or whatever it happened to be. But as a leader, as a legislator, if your goal is to achieve an end result, there is that kind of negotiation that occurs. As a politician, in the sense of running for something, you want to leave as much room for yourself as you possibly can beyond those things that are so fundamental that you have to put a stake in the ground. And so I think it makes it enormously difficult to do that.
Is it also true that there is a lingo, that the longer you're inside the belt,
oh yeah,
and in some ways the more successful you are,
you start talking the talk.
Shorthand.
Sure you do. Sure you do. And people were always complaining that Dole talked like, the leader, and talked in shorthand, and talked in, sentences that made sense to people that were legislating. Well, this amendment and that amendment, and we're going to do cloture, and we're going to, have a conference committee, and we're going to have a colloquy. You do talk, and it's like any profession. The healthcare world is probably the worst. We all talk in acronyms, but hell, everybody does. It's the Defense Department or wherever it is. And Dole talked like a legislator, and so the short bumper sticker, your instinct is to say, I want to do X and then explain it, because that's what you're used to doing. The demand is to just say X and let somebody else figure out how you're going to do it. And I think that does become complicated. And some people can switch back and forth much more easily. Dole was never as facile as others in the sort of one-liner. He was there are things about him that he has the best timing of any comedian I've ever known. He's just unbelievable. He's so quick. But the sort of policy translation. And he tortured us for good reason, that we talk like policy people. Because that's what we were. And perhaps we weren't as sensitive to the political side and the sort of one-liner that, running for office calls for. And that's a hard transition, and some people are better at it than others.
Isn't it also true that, the nature of the presidency, particularly over the last 20, 30 years, maybe post-JFK, President Harry Truman said famously, the chief job is persuasion.
Right.
But presidential persuasion is now increasingly theatrical.
Oh.
It's staged.
It is beyond staged.
And it's become very inauthentic, and people know it, and
right.
they're very dissatisfied with it.
Right.
But persuasion on the Hill, and particularly
It's
behind
very
closed
different.
doors,
It's a very different.
totally different, isn't it?
Very different. And it is enormously personal. It is enormously one-to-one. It is not playing to the crowd, because you're dealing with people who are used to having that conversation. You're dealing with people who want a result and want a commitment on an end result. And the consequences are quite quick and quite clear. And, the other interesting thing, I think, on the Hill, and I think it's one of the things that's most remarkable, is how dependent people are on that personal relationship. As the senator has said in the past, the one thing you have is your reputation and essentially the agreement of a handshake and your word, and that's the last thing that you ever want to lose. And so, your word is your bond, and you give it carefully if you're wise, and that's a very personal matter. I mean, people knew they could deal with the boss and know that he would hold to his word, and that he wasn't going to say things glibly and then come back and say, we'll tell him I lied. Sort of a famous Russ Blanc story about the, chicken in every pot, we'll tell him I lied, kind of thing at the end of the thing. I think it was his Uncle Earl who said it. Well, what about that chicken there? I'll tell him I lied.
By the way, did Russell Blanc, did he talk about his father? Talk about Huey or?
Yes, and sometimes at the most inopportune times. I mean, he would tell some story, or, actually it wasn't specific to his uncle, but I'll never recall, we were in the middle of some welfare reform matter, some issue having to deal with low-income assistance, and he started talking at length about how he couldn't hire anybody to clean his windows, and, what's wrong with, and you just kind of wanted to think, oh my, well, yeah, I'm prepared to pay him, $4 an hour, it's more, you just, oh my God. But yes, he would slip into stories occasionally. They were always quite humorous. But the point is that the conversations that occur behind closed doors are so remarkable and so personal. And it's very different than standing in front of a room of however many people and saying what you need to say and moving on, because you're not going to face them the next day.
What you're saying is Dole's strengths are off camera.
They are. They
primarily.
are. No question. No question.
In an era when the camera has increasingly come to dominate.
Increasingly critical. And, I do think it's interesting. I had the same experience you had, which is after the election, everybody sort of said, God, well, how come we didn't see that Bob Dole? I think he got better. I think he got more comfortable. But at the end of the day, he is somebody for whom personal relationships and connections were enormously important. And it's difficult to translate that for some people. And you think of the people that we've had, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, who are so facile in terms of, Reagan wasn't as good, at least in the experiences I had in a room where he sat with 15 senators or something. He wasn't as good at the detail. He wasn't as good at that kind of legislating. But in front of a group, I mean, he was charismatic. And Dole's strength was clearly in the room it's sort of like the difference between Tony Bennett and Sting. I mean, Tony Bennett's always going to be better in a small room, and Sting's, going to do great in front of Madison Square Garden. It's a different style.
You mentioned Medicare. Let me ask you, how did Dole and his conservatism evolve over the time that you knew him? And I know that gets into all sorts of other issues, but the party was clearly moving to the right.
Yes.
He sometimes gave the appearance of chasing after it, not always successfully. We can think of a number of instances in which there was certainly internal stresses.
Yes.
As increasingly, particularly the religious right, came to call the shots in the national party. And where was he in all of that, and how did it evolve? And because he often looked uncomfortable.
Hardline.
Pandering. I I mean, he's not a good panderer.
No, he's not.
He's not a good actor.
No, he's not. And that, I think, is to his credit. The thing that I found, at least in the issues that I was responsible for over time, was a remarkable sensitivity to the common man. And whether it was welfare, whether it was Social Security, disability, food stamps, the budget impasse when we, went into the black hole during the sort of early Gingrich days when we shut down the government. At the end of the day, I think Dole's view was, in fact, truly a conservative view, and that is that there is a role, but a limited role for government. But it is an important role, and there are people for whom the government is the safety net, and for whom it is important to give them assistance to support them in their lives, but that they have to make an effort to support themselves. And
do you think that was influenced by his own experiences after the war?
Oh, absolutely. Not only his own experiences after the war, the experience of his family being dependent upon welfare, his family living in the basement of their home. Also, the kindness and goodness of strangers and of neighborhoods. I mean, he was the first one, it takes a village. I mean, if you think about it, long before Hillary Clinton, Bob Dole was, in fact, dependent upon the village. When they all collected money in that cigar box. He ultimately, I think, had an extraordinary appreciation for what government can do, but also a sensitivity to what it can do run amok. And the fact that it isn't dependent upon drawing funds from people who are, in fact, supporting themselves and their families. And so the balancing between what government can do and should do in supporting people and what people ought to do for themselves. You'd walk into a room with him, however many people there were in the room, he was immediately drawn to the person in the wheelchair. He was immediately drawn to the person who was challenged in some fashion, with an absolute comfort. But he was also highly suspicious of organized constituencies that spoke for these folks. You and I have both heard him go off about some of these advocacy groups that he didn't feel were in fact benefiting the people for whom they were organized. And they were just, professional, sort of advocates. But when it really came down to the individual, I also recall during the budget shutdown, it was one of the many days where we were going back and forth over some kind of a continuing resolution to try and open things back up and allow us to continue to negotiate this sort of budget stalemate. And I was sent into the cloakroom to call over to the House and find out, whether we were going to be able to move something. And the answer came back, no way, no how, we're holding. And I went out to tell him, and it was on the floor. He was standing up from the well, and I said, I just checked in with a particular leader on the House side, and they said, no way. And he said, you tell them the next time that I'm not holding it. Because unlike them, there are people who live on their paychecks from paycheck to paycheck, and half of those people have never understood what it was like to go without a paycheck. He was so angry, not at the principle of trying to be, fiscally reasonable, but at the pain it was causing to people who had no responsibility, and the lack of understanding of the sensitivity of that issue for people who really were dependent. And you saw that time and time again. You saw that in Social Security issues, you saw that in disability issues, you saw that in food stamp issues. I'm sure there are people to this day who think he did it simply food stamps because of the ag community. This was a man who knew what it was like to live in circumstances where people potentially went hungry. And so...
There's a real streak of populism.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And it comes out of sort of bedrock beliefs in a Kansas upbringing, where people are tough and they're independent, but they're also dependent upon one another. You work hard, and you don't count on others to bail you out, but you help your colleagues and your friends and your neighbors when you need to.
And it could find expression in pointed jokes about Gucci Ghost?
Oh, absolutely. Not that he was, immune to, to that in the sense of, he had done well in his life. I think better than he ever expected. And, like a lot of us who came up from either lower or middle class families, doing better than ever expected and far better than our parents ever did, we still are surprised, not having been, gifted with that. And I think he was always a little uncomfortable with enormous wealth. I mean, they used to laugh about the sort of millionaire caucus in the Senate, which was remarkable, but he was never comfortable in that world, I think. I mean, he obviously has done very well, he and Elizabeth both, but at heart, I think he's a Kansas kid, and that's where his values are.
There's a scene in the Woodward book which struck me, because in some ways it's so unnecessary, but it's revealing. There's some sort of strategy session, and obviously consistent with the Hollywood speech and all of this that's promoted, as the winning strategy in '96. And someone must have said something, because all of a sudden he went off, and he didn't have to, basically talking about gay people, and said, we're not going to single out any group to go after. I mean, it was this kind of almost ferocious counter to the implication that there's political advantage to be had by exploiting these cultural divisions.
Right.
And I wonder to what extent the whole kind of social values, because he is a social values conservative, there's no doubt about it, but there's a subtle distinction between, in effect, living it because it's in your bloodstream, and sort of politically exploiting it, particularly when it comes to people, individuals.
Well, and I think that's the point. Where he may agree or disagree with lifestyle choices or, any number of things in terms of people's beliefs, political beliefs, religious beliefs, whatever they happen to be. I don't think I can think of an instance where he would deliberately harm, embarrass, single out an individual or their choice. He could personally disagree, but the thought of him, standing on the floor railing about people who'd made a different decision than he'd made about lifestyle or religion is so antithetical to him as a human being. I think he is enormously understanding of people who have different views. He could hold different views in his own right, but I don't think he would ever take advantage, unless it was just so abhorrent. I mean, sort of overt racial discrimination, someone who had, whose views were based in hate. I can't imagine him tolerating that.
Tolerate is a good word, because I wonder, presumably too, when you get to the point of leading the Senate, you learn tolerance because you're dealing with a lot of people
you learn the patience of Job.
Who have human weaknesses.
Right. Picadillos.
Well, yeah, exactly.
Yes.
How did he deal with all of that?
Again, he really did have the patience of Job. And I don't know whether that is out of sort of experience under fire. I mean, his own sort of patience that it required to come back from World War II and his injuries. The months and months of sort of, being, waiting for that small increment of improvement. He could be quick-tempered, as we all know, but he would never fail to surprise us when we were all chomping at the bit on something, going after someone or some issue, and he would just, you just wait. You wait it out. And similarly with sort of watching the cast of characters, and we had from the sublime to the ridiculous in the Senate in terms of personal behaviors. I mean, people that would have, raging, pouting, screaming, meltdowns. People would come up, it's Thursday at noon, are we getting out today? I want to go off and play golf. It's like, please. where he just showed enormous patience and restraint, and the ability to sort of tolerate those differences. We were on the floor one night quite late, 2 o'clock in the morning or some ridiculous hour, and waiting for a consent agreement, waiting for an agreement to essentially allow us to proceed or close down, knowing what the rules were going to be the next day. And we were all just crazed, you know. And his counterpart, the person who was the leader at the time, just wasn't giving us anything, had sort of disappeared into the ether. And we were all just, you know, just get on the floor and, you know, start. And he was just, you know, he waited out. And I think to his credit, the members came to understand and appreciate that. Came to know that he wasn't likely to do the hair trigger kind of thing. And I think felt in that his tolerance and his willingness to let him melt down, which occasionally they all needed to do. And he used his own sort of response and anger and level of response, frankly, as a tool. I mean, you know, it didn't happen very often. When it did, people knew it was very serious. It wasn't the sort of histrionics that you see from somewhere, you know, the slightest thing and they're sort of off-railing. I think are far less effective than people like Senator Dole, who were very clear that when it mattered, it mattered. When it didn't, you know, you just let people, you know, these are people, all of whom have constituencies, all of whom have needs. And I think that benefited him as a leader.
That bipartisan respect that he enjoys, is that something that grew over time?
Yes. And I think it was,
becoming chairman of the Finance Committee a kind of a turning point?
I think becoming ranking first and then chairman, I think there's no question people expected, because it came so soon after the '76 election. I mean, I think people expected the biting, you know, divisive politics. And what they came to see over time was someone who had an interest in actually resolving issues and was remarkably respectful. You know, whether it was of Long, whether it was of Moynihan, whomever it happened to be, or even on his own side. I mean, a wide array of points of view in terms of, you know, from Phil Graham to John Chafee, that, you know, he had an interest in convening. He had an interest in consensus. You know, when we had to, we forced it through, and we put the chairman's mark on the table, and we moved it. But he was remarkably responsive. Similarly with the House, you know, whether it was Rostenkowski or whomever it happened to be, you know, Charlie Rangel. I mean, there, you know, you can imagine the sort of cast of characters in both the House and the Senate. I think people on both sides of the aisle, but on the Democratic side particularly, came to see that here was someone with whom we could deal. Here is someone that you could trust, someone whose word you could take as a pledge and a bond. Certainly with respect to Senator Byrd, when Dole and Byrd were leaders, and with respect to Senator Mitchell, when he and Dole were leaders, neither of them ever surprised one another. In both cases, they had remarkably good relations where they could talk person to person, and they both had constituencies who were difficult to manage. You know, and the number of times Martha Pope and I sat in the room and listened to Senator Mitchell and Senator Dole talk about what they were dealing with in their own caucuses as they were trying to get some rational behavior. You know, but you never heard a word of that out of the room. They never breached those confidences, nor did they use them to their individual advantage. You know, Dole didn't then go out of the room and say, "Oh, we ought to hear what Mitchell had to say about." Sure. Never happened. Never happened.
But the evolution of the Republicans, say, in the Senate, a lot of it's generational.
Yes.
It's ideological, but generational.
Yes. Yes.
So, I mean, dealing with, from a Alan Simpson conservative to a Trent Lott conservative, who was sort of first cousin to a Newt Gingrich conservative, that whole transformation really that occurred during his watch of the Republican Party. I mean, how comfortable or uncomfortable was he sort of philosophically and then individually.
Well, you know, it's interesting. It's not just philosophy, although that had an enormous impact in terms of the sort of development of the sort of conservative movement and the transition from somebody like a John Chafee Republican to a Trent Lott Republican. It was generational, no question. It also was. It was an expectation. I mean, you had an increasing number of people coming from the House. You had an increasing number of people who were younger, who had less history, but also potentially less commitment in terms of the institutional behaviors and policies. You had a society that was becoming more impatient. And so, you know, as Dole would say, you know, his first years in the Senate, I mean, you didn't say anything for the first couple of years. You know, and your first speech on the Senate floor was a big deal, his, of course, having been about disabilities. You know, by the time he left, I mean, you know, the freshmen would show up and they'd be on the floor talking. And there was less acknowledgement of your seniors and less acknowledgement of the history that preceded you and those relationships. Less commitment to those relationships lasting. I mean, you know, Danny Inouye and Bob Dole having been in the hospital together. I mean, that was a history of experience and time, and they, you know, so it's a whole host of things. It's the politics, it's the change in philosophy, it is the behavioral changes and societal changes that made the institution different.
But isn't there also this fundamental dichotomy that I've never been able to resolve, that there was an increasing libertarian streak in conservatism.
Yes.
And there's a whole school of thought that argues rather without a whole lot of sophistication or nuance, that government's the problem.
Yes,
so
no question.
How do you reconcile wanting to be, in effect, the party of government, if a substantial portion of your troops believe that government is, at the very least, an enemy?
Well, I think that was the great challenge for Dole in his last few years, and I think, you know, people talk about in the last couple of years there wasn't an inch of air between he and Gingrich in a number of cases. You know, when things were coming over, particularly in the Contract for America, and they were, you know, shipping stuff over, and Dole had, you know, really didn't have a lot of movement, you know, because he had Graham, you know, chipping at his heels, and I think it became increasingly difficult for him. You know, he did have people within the party, you know, Chafee and others, who were, you know, pulling on the other side. But even with healthcare reform in the early Clinton years, you know, when we saw the sort of moderates try to, you know, structure some middle ground, you know, historically Dole probably would have been right in there trying to find that middle ground, but at the end he had to distance himself and did.
Yeah, even consensus became a dirty word.
A very dirty word.
A synonym for surrender.
Yes, absolutely. And of course the expectation on the part of some of the right wing that's where Dole always really was, that we really couldn't trust him. You know, at the end of the day he was always prepared to compromise the fundamentals to, you know, it was all about getting the deal. And so it was, you know, it was working against the expectations. And so in some cases I think his instincts might have been to try and strike a middle ground and try and find a solution and go around and have a conversation, as he did with Moynihan on Social Security. But the circumstances of the day made that difficult and almost impossible in some cases to do. And I think it became more difficult over time. And certainly as the House became more radical and more engaged, and he was, you know, being pressured with an increasing number of, you know, very conservative individuals in the Senate, you know, he was boxed in terms of his ability to, you know, do what he would have traditionally done.
How did that affect you? I mean, on your wall you have the New York Times Magazine cover story.
Yes.
The campaign to demonize Sheila Burke. What was the campaign and how did it affect him?
You know, it was an interesting experience in a couple of ways. One, I had always been viewed with some suspicion, and increasingly as the conservatives became more active in the party, as having liberal leanings. And, you know, that wasn't necessarily a new concern, but it clearly escalated. And what occurred were literally over a 6 or 8 month period, a series of articles from the Journal to the Times to the Washington Post to Business Week to Newsweek, and it was a series of stories that kept sort of quoting one another. Everything
And this was
from
when, roughly?
This was
before 96?
This was before 96, and it was it got to the point where it was articles quoting other articles, quoting individuals, having quoted individuals. I found it interesting at the time that a number of the people who wrote the stories never spoke to me, ever. But it was triggered in part by the issues of the day, which was welfare reform. And, you know, a series of meetings with the conservative organizations, some of the family groups and some of the others, where, you know, arguably I was perhaps not as tolerant or patient as I might have been in the course of conversations. I was viewed as hostile. You know, there were issues around whether marriage was the fundamental of society. My view was it was certainly important, but it wasn't, you know, there were a whole lot of people who were single who were contributing to society as well. You know, religious groups and people who'd chosen, you know, celibacy and a variety of other things who were also part of society who ought to be acknowledged. But it was viewed as an outright hostile act. And I think, you know, the interest was, one, in damaging Dole, and sort of this is another example of where Dole is soft and he has these people around him. The suggestion that I was leading him in a direction that was antithetical to sort of the very conservative points of view on issues like welfare reform, which were quite important at the time. And I think it was very difficult for him. I mean, I think there was story after story, including a story that said, you know, men of Dole's generation, you know, were particularly susceptible to women like me who were aggressive. And you know, at the time, I sort of commented that...
That's sort of stereotype on stereotype.
Stereotype on stereotype. But, you know, the thing I found amusing was, of course, I can't imagine anybody less likely to be pushed in a direction he didn't want to go than Bob Dole. And I also fundamentally was of the view that the one thing I was good at was understanding who was in charge. You know, and I think our staff was strong because my view of the staff was you present Dole with the facts, both sides, and you let him choose. But you want to make sure he has the basis upon which to make a decision that's well-reasoned. And he could choose to go either way, and there were a number of issues upon which I disagreed with him. He knew that, I knew that. I wasn't about to try and confuse him about that, and didn't ever want to be in a situation where I'd gotten him to vote on something that was at odds with where he was. But I think it was very difficult. I think he was under a lot of pressure by the campaign staff, as well as by the, you know, sort of the conservative constituencies to get rid of me. You know, we had this odd situation where at one point Bob Byrd went to the floor and went on at length about, you know, you want to go after Dole, go after Dole. It's not about his staff. I mean, you know, if you have a problem with him, deal with him. You know, why are you dumping on the staff? But at the end of the day, he made a decision that, you know, I was contributing, that he wasn't concerned that at the end of the day, my being on his staff was going to put him at risk. I offered to resign, went into him and said, I'm prepared to step down at the end of the day if this is going to be harmful to you at the campaign and just harmful for you in terms of getting your business done here. I'm prepared to resign. And he said, nope. You know, I think the right thing to do is to stay there and to, you know, to continue to work through. But it was a very difficult period, difficult for him, difficult for me. You know, in my view as a staff person, never wants to see their name in the paper. I certainly didn't. And I'd spent years, you know, 18 years before that, not being in the paper. And I sure as hell didn't want the last year and a half to be in the paper.
I think it's interesting because I mean, I can think of other people, like just my own experience, where career, I always went out of the way. If a reporter called, I wouldn't talk.
Right.
And even when I'm to this day convinced, that Time Magazine story in '96 where he leaked the memo that I'd written, about you're feeding the crocodiles and all of this. And I wouldn't talk to anyone.
Right.
And you think that got points with him? That, I mean, that people, I mean, it was kind of loyalty. Because in this town, most people, let's face it, given the opportunity to promote themselves.
Do.
Yes.
It's interesting. I think there are two things that are interesting. One, I think he was enormously grateful that he didn't have people who leaked stuff all over town. And it was important to him. And it was important to him that people weren't out there promoting themselves. In the same vein, though, interestingly enough, I think to the extent that we were subject experts, whether it was Rod when he was a staff director and substantive on tax policy, or Carolyn Weaver who was doing Social Security, or Sidney Olson who did welfare. I think he enjoyed having them noted as experts, noted as having said things, or noted as having saying the senator, says the following, and was quite supportive of that, and would say, go and talk to, make this clear. And so it would depend on the context and depend on the subject matter. I think he was pleased that I was viewed as an expert in health policy and was often, sourced in terms of health issues. But that was a substantive policy-related matter, and we were always very careful about, doing it in a way that was supportive of Dole, or where Dole was, or this is why the senator is doing the following things. But he was blessed in that we didn't have people, therefore, that were out just doing their thing, with a couple of rare exceptions. And I think all of us who were in leadership, whether it was me or Rod or Bob, I think we'd have fired anybody we found leaking stuff.
And don't you think there really was a qualitative difference between the personal staff or committee staff, for that matter, and the campaign staff?
There was certainly
in '96.
Certainly in '96 there was a difference. But I think that's in part the nature of those jobs.
Yeah.
I've always viewed campaign staffs, and it's the only experience I had, the time I spent with the campaign after we left the Senate. Campaign staffs are, and I don't mean this in a pejorative way, are mercenaries. I mean, they are people to a large extent who come in who are experts in running campaigns. And that is their job, and that is what they know a great deal about. And most of them tend to move on, to the next one. There are some that obviously stay with the member, but in most cases, the big campaigns like this are people who, do campaigns and then move on. Whereas your committee staff, personal staff, and others, these are people who are in it for the long haul in terms of an individual and in terms of their policy agenda. And so you approach it, I think, somewhat differently. You come with different expertise, you come with different expectations.
But even in the worst case scenario, you bought someone's loyalty. You bought their silence.
No question. No question. No question.
And when, from time to time, as it became painfully apparent in the '96 campaign, things weren't going terribly well.
Yes.
And there were people who were eager.
Yes.
Off the record, and sometimes on the record, to disassociate themselves from troubles.
No question, because they have the mind toward moving on to the next thing, and not being part of a failure. And I think there is a difference with staff that have been engaged with an individual over a long period of time. But I think politics, unfortunately, to a certain extent, breeds that kind of. I mean, you see it today, you see it all the time, where who's talking out of school and what they're saying, and I think it's an unpleasant and unfortunate aspect of the world in which we live. And there are people who like getting their names in the paper, and people who like being sourced as the expert on. You see it in today's campaigns, whether it's people talking about John McCain, or talking about Fred Thompson, or talking about, whoever.
We're sort of almost doing this backwards, but I have to tell you, I'll never forget, as long as I live, a week before the '96 convention, I was in Grand Rapids, and I got a call. She called first and said he would be calling. And he called, and they were so spooked at that point. The Woodward book was out.
Yes, yes.
And they were so, understandably affected by the thought that these people, who assumably were loyalists,
Yes.
would in fact have blabbed
Yes.
Woodward. Even though, on balance, Dole came off looking pretty good.
He did,
in the book.
comparatively
Woodward says
speaking.
today he voted for Dole.
Yeah.
That said, but so Senator gets on the phone, and he's got the acceptance speech. And on the one hand, Elizabeth is torn, because Elizabeth wants everything baked into the cake weeks in advance, so you can
No
prepare.
surprises.
Never
Right.
mind the content, it's delivery.
Right.
At the same time, that same degree of caution wants everything to be perfect.
Right.
And clearly, they weren't comfortable with this. So he gets on the phone, and he wants, to go over the speech. And I said, okay, let me get the fax number. He said, no. He said, I'll read it to you. Which right away tells me they're really
Yeah, we're in trouble.
Okay.
Right.
So he starts reading the speech. And of course, Mark Halperin, who has great strengths,
Yes.
but has a certain apocalyptic view of the world.
Yes.
And it's on and on and on about age. And my heart is sinking because I'm thinking like Clinton. Because I know that the bridge to the 21st century is taking shape paragraph by paragraph.
Right.
And there are ways to use your age to advantage.
Yes.
But it's not by sounding crotchety and
old.
Culturally superior to the electorate.
Right.
Well, anyway, but the funny thing is, like the first paragraph of somebody, he talks about the advantages of age, and it instills serenity. And I said, wait a second, Senator, stop right there. I said, you are many things.
Yeah, but
you're
serene is not among them. You're not near the tomb here. Right.
Anyway, we went on. Anyway, that conversation, he said, well, would you be willing to come to San Diego? I said, now stop and think, Senator. The worst thing in the world that could happen would be if I came to San Diego and word got out and Halperin
went ballistic.
And of course, in the end,
that's where we were.
What happened.
Right.
It does raise questions that at that point in the campaign was something that important. It could be that much influx. And how much of it was just nerves, the biggest speech of your career, how much of it reflected divisions within the campaign, itself. What does it tell you about?
What it tells me about Dole is a number of things. One, as you and I have found, he develops a comfort and a trust in a limited number of individuals. I mean, he deals with lots of people. He has a limited number of individuals he really trusts and whose judgment he trusts. And when there is concern, those are the people to whom he turns. I had a recent experience where he called about looking to hire someone for a project he was involved in. And we talked about somebody that I suggested someone, and we talked about it. And at the end of the day, that's the person he chose to hire. And as I talked with him about the person, what I talked to him about was, this is somebody who will watch your back. This is someone who, at the end of the day, will be sensitive to you and your concerns and your needs, and with whom you can be absolutely direct and straightforward and honest, and certain that that will be held in confidence. And my guess is part of what you saw was a throwback to the days where he could deal with you in a way that he knew it wasn't going to get leaked. He knew you weren't going to take advantage of it. He knew you would be direct and honest with him, because you didn't owe him anything. Or you didn't, not that you didn't owe him anything. You had nothing at risk here. I mean, in a sense. I mean, this was a relationship that was long-standing. He also knew you'd be absolutely straightforward with him. And I think when pressure occurs, when they are anxious, they go to the people they trust.
So
it's like her calling me when she was hiring her staff in the Senate, and she wasn't comfortable that she was necessarily getting all the judgment she needed. she calls the people she trusts. I think it was an enormous compliment to you. I think it reflected anxiety on his part and anxiety in the environment in which he was, where he wasn't certain he could trust everything he was being told or heard. And how many times after you'd left us did he, have me call you and say, Rick, can you, how many times since, I haven't worked for him, in almost 11 years. How many times do I get the call? And it's because at the end of the day, I remember when he had this last, now a while ago, but when he became so ill, and we were very worried about him, and he was hospitalized, and up in New York, and then here as well, and there were only a couple of us that, she called and he called and said, oh, if you have any time or if you're free today, come on over. And when he's in periods of time like that, he falls back on the people he trusts. And I think it's a credit to him, and a very human reaction,
Do you remember when Dr. Quicken died?
Yes.
How he...
it was like losing his father. It was like losing, I think it was like when Joanne died. It was, it was like losing a part of himself. Someone who had seen him at his weakest, and someone who was there without hesitation, without question, without reason. Just because they were there. And, I think there were probably, 10 people in his life. Bob Ellsworth, Dr. Klickian, Joanne, I'd like to think I'm one of those people. Rod, I think, is one of those people. Certainly, his wife, Elizabeth, is clearly the first on that list. But my guess is that's a relatively small universe. He talks to a bazillion people, and I'll bet there are 15 or 20 that, if you asked him.
Were you on the floor when he went over to pay his tribute to Dr. Quicken?
I don't remember.
Yeah.
I think I was.
Because he started and he couldn't continue. Go on.
Yes.
And I think it was Jesse Helms sort of, stepped into the breach.
Right.
And then Dole started again.
Yes.
And he got to the poem at the end.
Yeah, couldn't do it.
And couldn't do it.
Couldn't do it.
It was like the Nixon eulogy.
It was. When we all flew out for the funeral. One of the stranger airplane flights.
Tell me about it.
I'm trying to remember who it was.
Because George McGovern
was on the plane. Bob Packwood was on the plane. And I think it was G. Gordon Liddy. It was one of the Nixon. It was either Liddy. I think it was Liddy who was on the plane. Corlogus was on the plane with us. And it was like a scene out of I don't know what kind of movie. Listening to the stories, I think it was G. Gordon. It was one of the Nixon sort of mafia, and it was just an amazing flight out. Just listening to the members talk with one another and their own recollections. And I was lucky. Saw Nixon when he came to the Senate a number of times, and it always amazed me, notwithstanding everything else. Dole would invite people over, and the room would be full, Democrats and Republicans, to listen to him. And it was usually after he'd come back from China or come back from someplace as a private citizen. But Dole really made an effort to bring him back, in a sense.
Can you explain, because I saw he kept those letters
Yes.
in the desk.
Yes, yes.
And I'll never forget one day, he said, I heard from your pen pal. And
Yes.
he'd open the desk, and here was this stack of handwritten letters.
Yes.
Shameless flattery.
Yes.
You could see what Nixon was up to.
Oh, absolutely.
It was transparent.
Absolutely, absolutely.
But can you explain, logically, given what Dole went through,
Right, because of that.
and the basically being dumped,
Yes,
and almost losing his seat in '74,
right.
and all of that, and yet there was a very special bond, an emotional bond.
Yeah, I don't know
between
that
them.
I don't know that I can. I don't know that I can. I don't know whether it is Dole's instinctive sort of, here's somebody who just got, the crap beat out of him, and, in part for good reason, but who also contributed enormously. I hope that's not one of my museums.
Dole's America certainly overlapped with the silent majority.
No question. No
Culturally,
question.
there was an affinity.
No question. But I don't know that that's it. There's no question that the letters were really quite remarkable. But there was also no question that, setting everything else aside, Nixon had an extraordinary sense of foreign policy and of the sort of global issues. But I don't, I honestly don't know. It was always kind of an odd situation. And I was always stunned that these people would show up who you would think would be just antithetical to everything Nixon stood for from a personal standpoint. So I don't know if it was just the intellectual curiosity. I don't know whether it was because of, a sense that, he had done extraordinarily terrible things, but had contributed in a number of ways in terms of, his contribution to sort of moving, the agenda forward in a foreign policy. I don't know the answer to that question.
It's funny, from time to time people suggested more of a parallel between the two than I really think exists. Because it's, well, in a sense, they both obviously came up from extraordinarily,
yes.
They both worked their way up to the top through sheer merit. They were not necessarily naturals.
Right.
It took real labor. And yet my sense is, for all of the so-called dark side, that Dole was a fundamentally more integrity.
Moral.
Yeah.
Yes.
Dole
never crossed the line.
Dole's son.
Never crossed the line. And somehow never lost track of where the line needed to be.
Russell, Kansas.
Yes.
Was always with him.
And
Nixon, on the end, it was rootless.
Yes, and you never sense that about Dole. And I can't imagine him ever surrounding himself with people, who would have moved him in that direction. And he didn't. If you think about the people he surrounded himself with, arguably he may not have had the strongest political staff, and that may have been one of the, he didn't have the sort of Karl Roves or, Jim Bakers or people like that.
Could he have had those? Would he have,
would he have ever been comfortable?
Would he have been comfortable? Would he have ceded that degree of authority?
Well, query whether he ceded a fair amount of authority to Joanne, and I think he did, politically. What if you'd have 4 of Joanne or 5 of Joanne? Sort of kind of Haldeman, Ehrlichman, sort of, or if you look at Bush, Bush 1 or Bush 2, or Clinton in terms of, sort of his retinue of people. He did cede a lot of authority to Joanne on a political basis. And the question is whether in doing that to one person he didn't get the perspective and the bench strength that he might have needed. He wasn't somebody who handed over responsibility easily, as you and I both know, from a policy standpoint. He was always, sort of, you were careful about how far you went afield. It took a long time to develop a relationship that allowed you that freedom. I ultimately had it, Bob, Rod, all of us had it. But on the political side, you didn't, he was always there, always making those decisions, and the only check was, in fact, Joanne. And so query whether, would he have benefited from a broader array, and, having developed that relationship with her, whether she would have ever permitted it. And not clear to me she would have, and he made that decision. He could have, altered that, chose not to for reasons, that made sense to him. But I think the difference with Nixon was that he never it never crossed that line and wasn't fundamentally ruthless. Nixon did compliment me on my legs, so I think of him fondly. Even to this day. He said I had great legs. Bob Dole damn near died at the time, but it was in comparison to Hillary Clinton at the time. Dole said she knows more about healthcare than, forgotten more than Hillary knows, and Nixon said, well, yeah, she's got better legs. So I just want the record to show that.
That's his gift for small talk, manifesting itself.
And of course, Dole was, paled visibly, and I think Corlogus backed out of the room, and I think Bob Packwood was there, and he backed out of the room. But it is, I'll carry that in my memories.
My theory, for whatever it's worth, is Nixon never did an uncalculated thing in his life.
No.
And if you look at both Mrs. Nixon's funeral as well as his own, he saw to it that Bob Dole was the eulogist.
Yes.
And I will go to my grave convinced Dole's candidates for 96 were Bob Dole and Pete Wilson.
Yes.
Both of whom spoke at both funerals.
Yes. Interesting.
Richard Nixon knew Bob Dole well enough to know that he wouldn't be able to get through a eulogy.
Oh, that's interesting.
Without breaking down.
That's interesting.
And he knew that was the best thing
that could happen
to Bob Dole.
Interesting.
I literally believe that now.
Interesting.
I can never prove it, but
that's an interesting question.
It's just very Nixonian.
It was
remarkable.
Wanted
to show him off.
It was remarkable. It was remarkable. That's an interesting question. Very interesting question.
How difficult was the decision to leave the Senate, and what were the origins of it?
I think it was very difficult. It was a place he loved. It was a place that loved him. I think it was the campaign and the campaign staff who convinced him that he couldn't do both, that increasingly he was going to be at risk having to run the place and having that be a target for people that he was running the place or was positioning himself or wasn't there, at the time that was more of an issue.
It was more than this sort of tactical need to shake up a campaign that had become sort of dead in the water.
That may well have been part of it, but I really sensed it was more, you can't, keep acting, if you're there, you're going to act like a legislator. The impatience of the campaign folks. Now, that's not to suggest that at the end of the day it wasn't his decision, because clearly it was his, and it may well have been in part, to shake things up. But I think it was more, you can't be here and do what you have to do and not be increasingly exposed and distracted. I mean, at the end of the day, God bless him, and I'm sure I'm as much at fault as anybody. I mean, we were checking in and asking, and, Simpson was running the place, but, Dole's instinct was when you're in charge, when you're the guy, you're the guy. And, he felt the responsibility of that, even in the campaign.
How widely would he have consulted before taking a decision like that?
Not very, I don't think. I don't know that for a fact. I'm sure he did talk with some folks, but he was also somebody who, when he wanted to make a decision, he made a decision. And I suspect also the desire to keep it confidential, to have it, be a decision. Once you make it, you make it, and that's that.
Do you remember how he broke the news to you?
Yes, I remember it very well. He walked into my office, and he'd been in with Scott, and it was not unknown that the campaign was pushing hard, that there was this anxiety about his divided loyalties. I mean, campaign running the Senate, that he was under increasing pressure from a lot of his colleagues. I mean, you're gone all the time, and we gotta, we can't just have you gone all the time and have everybody focused on you. And he had the advantage of having the floor, but of course that became an issue. Every time he rose on the floor, it was Bob Dole presidential candidate. So I mean, there was no question that there was a lot of street conversation. But he walked into my office and sat down, and you'll recall I had that wonderful office that used to be a Supreme Court Justice's chambers, wonderful vaulted room, and with a desk and some chairs and a big conference table. And he walked in and said, I've made the decision. It's it's time to go. And I really feel like I need to, be out there, and that people have to know how serious I am. That this is it. I mean, as the speech sort of said, this is it. It's this or nothing, and that we need to figure out how to tell the staff, and an orderly transition. I said, well, I think I remember saying, do you mean you're taking a leave of absence? And he said, no, this is it. I'm stepping down from the Senate, and, not leaving myself the ability, because I thought at first it was step down from leader, and just, sort of run as a senator from Kansas and not be leader. And no, I've got to make it clear to everybody that this is the most important thing to me, and I need to step down entirely from the Senate. He left the office having told me, and I got up and took a walk around the block, as I recall. So I remember it very well.
And then, did he break the news to his staff, or was that your responsibility? Or
I think we waited because we knew once the staff knew it would be public. I think we didn't tell them right away because we knew it would leak.
And were you in the meeting where he met with the Republican caucus?
Yes.
What was that like?
I don't think they were terribly surprised, but I think it's a place that power shifts pretty quickly, and some sadness on the part of some of his colleagues because they kind of knew what was coming.
He displayed his emotions.
Yes, he did. He did. Glee on the part of a couple of members, as you might imagine. But I think they saw the end of an era. And I remember as well when he went over to the Hart Building, to the top floor in the Hart Building to announce it, to do the public announcement, and how many of his Republican and Democratic colleagues came over. And I knew Newt came over from the House. In fact, I walked him over to Hart. Real sadness. Moynihan was there. I think people did, setting aside the campaign, I think people saw it as the end of an era in Republican leadership and in the career of somebody. I mean, I think everybody kind of knew where we were in the campaign. And I think they saw it as a passing. It was very hard.
If he regretted the decision at any time, would he have ever said so?
No. I think he's remarkable, and I think this has gotten him through a tremendous amount in his life, of once you decide to move, you move. And looking back, I don't think that, I think that would not have been helpful to him, and I don't think he would naturally then dwell on, oh my God, what if? I just think he makes the decisions and he moves on, and I think that's him and that's his life. I mean, you deal with tough stuff and you just get on with life, and I think that's what he did.
Was there a time during the fall campaign when you ever really thought that you could win? Apart from the natural need to believe to keep on going, but he's pretty realistic. He can count. He can
count better than any of us. I think all of us had it in our there'll be a surprise. It'll catch on, and the disgust with Clinton's personal behavior has to begin at some point to pay a price, or a price be paid. I don't know that he ever, he knew the numbers, knew where we were going. I mean, whether it was the 96-hour victory tour or, that somehow there'd be a surprise there.
It did narrow,
it narrowed it,
for
no
most
question.
of that campaign.
Yeah.
You look at the public polls,
Yeah.
18, 20-point spread.
Yeah, and
of course, now you had the fundraising stories that
Yes.
broke in mid-October.
yes.
And there's almost reluctance on the part of certain voters, at least, to
Yes.
close the deal.
Right. And so, I think there was a little bit of that, could this be the surprise? The sort of, do we wake up in the morning? But, whether he fundamentally really believed that, he certainly worked like he did. There was nobody more committed to doing the time and the efforts and being out there and being on the road, living on that frigging airplane in, all sorts of crazy places. Hard to say.
How much of it, too, was the need to demonstrate that the age issue wasn't an issue? Well, was that at
I think
least
that
a
was
factor?
less, I think that was probably some of it, certainly after Chico, after the fall. There was a lot of sensitivity. Those photographs in the magazines and newspapers were just horrific. And I'm sure there was a little bit of that in terms of the pushback and proving it. But I think more fundamentally, it's just in him to just throw yourself into it and do everything you have to do. I think the age issue is the age issue, and there was a certain amount of I can do this and just hang in there and work as hard as anybody.
Did you ever hear him speculate about a cabinet or Supreme Court nominations or any of the kinds of things?
Not the court.
President,
we rumbled a little around about cabinet, but not the court, really. I think he was wise enough, or maybe not, but I think he was more focused on the short term, getting this done and doing it well. I'm sure he had in his own mind, and we all grumbled and rumbled around about possible cabinet officers. I mean, one of the most interesting things was the vice presidential, the process of vetting the vice presidential candidates, and just the conversations that occurred around individuals and and how that progressed. And it gave you a little sense of how you might think about other decisions going forward and the kind of criteria and characteristics and what the constituency was that you were trying to solve.
Was Kemp's decision motivated, at least in part, again, by this need to kind of surprise people, to shake up the dynamic of a campaign that was increasingly fixed?
And the conservatives. No question. No question. There were a number of remarkably credible people on the list that we worked through, but there's no question that no one expected. I don't think many people expected it. I think it was in part a surprise. It was in part an acknowledgement of the conservative and age. I mean, you had somebody who was younger and very virile, and also, outreach. I mean, he was somebody who had a constituency that was
also turned out to be a less skillful debater than
it was a nightmare.
Might have been anticipated.
It was a nightmare. It was.
Do you ever wish you had a do-over, after that?
I wasn't on that debate prep team, but I did Dole's, but yes.
Did Dole take those preparations more seriously than, say, 76?
Oh, he took them enormously seriously. Really very seriously. Huge amount of work, huge amount of time on his part. And of course, in 76, he had a hell of a lot more to explain and talk about. But he took them very seriously. We had people come in and work with us. Fred Thompson was, played the part of Clinton in the debate, did a terrific job. Yeah. He was great to work with. But he took it very seriously. Yeah, he really did, and enormous amount of work. I mean, hours sitting in Florida. It's sort of like sitting on the beach up in the Capitol, where all of us were dying, and he didn't seem to break a sweat.
Yeah. Can you describe this Florida hideaway, getaway?
Oh my!
a certain time warp?
Yeah, I would say, early 50s in style and in occupants in terms of their age, not being in their early 50s, but having reached their age of majority in their 50s, in the 50s. I mean, it is an old style, old line Florida apartment building, but had the unique experience of having, Howard Baker, Tip O'Neill, was it David Brinkley? I can't remember, David Brinkley. I mean, just a bizarre array of
Earlier,
people.
I think both Humphrey, I know Tom Dewey died there.
Yes, and Humphrey, I think.
Was this all because of Dwayne Andreas?
It certainly had something to do with Dwayne, because Dwayne had a place there as well, and they all sort of knew him. And of course, it was next door to the hotel where the AFL-CIO used to hold their big meetings. It was the big Union Convention Hotel. But it was really like going back to the 50s. Restaurant, the sort of waiters from, the 1922. I mean, it was just, it was as far from the sort of high-end profile, massive sort of Florida place you should think of now. It was like something your parents owned.
And he was utterly comfortable.
Completely comfortable. As relaxed, as laid back, as sort of low-key as a person could be. We'd get up and we'd go sit outside and do these conversations. And of course, it was about 150 million degrees. And there we'd be baking. And, he was as laid back and comfortable. He wisely chose a place where he was just at home, relaxed, could focus, go to Joe's Stone Crab, and treat us all to dinner. He was just at home.
So he was different outside of Washington. Or he could be different
He could be. I don't know that I would describe him as different. I mean, I think one of the most remarkable times and trips I spent with him was when we went for the World War II memorial, the 50th anniversary. And it was probably one of the most emotional, but one of the most extraordinary experiences, where you saw him just completely relaxed with people that he cared deeply about, in an environment, where we'd go out in Rome for dinner, or where he was, as comfortable and sort of sitting back, have a glass of wine. I mean, you just never saw that here, with the number of guys who showed up in the office in the Capitol for a cocktail at the end of the day. You never ever saw the boss. A, you never heard him swear. B, you never really saw him in any fashion at any time. Just that sort of laid back, as comfortable as he was with his colleagues. But there's something about certain environments where he is just very much at home.
Have you seen him in awe of someone? I mean, for example, meeting the Pope.
Yes, I was just going to say the Pope. When we had our audience with the Pope.
This is John Paul II.
This is John Paul. There is, I mean, even for somebody who's a Roman Catholic, there was something mystical about that experience. And Dole not being a Catholic, there was
because of that particular Pope?
Yes.
Or the aura?
Well, I haven't met a lot of them. It's the only one I personally know by name, who passes the high Sheila test. There was something mystical about that experience and about that person, because he was just such an extraordinary human being. But certainly that. Clicking. There was something about him that Dole revered. I don't know if I'd call him in awe, but certainly that Dole revered in terms of who he was and the things he had done. Those are the two that come immediately to mind.
It's odd, it's not the same level, but I was always struck to the end of his life by the extent to which he held President Ford. in
Yes.
this kind of
Yes, yes.
very special
But again, I think
category. Obviously, gratitude.
And not just gratitude, but I also think, again, not unlike your comments about Nixon, you know, here is somebody who came from relatively simple, worked his way up, you know, just a real comfortable person, extraordinary integrity, you know, so I think it was his comfort, but just the nature of the person, I think he found remarkable. I was interested in his reaction to Maggie Thatcher. I think, I don't know to describe it as awe, but I think she was such a presence. I mean, the few times that he would have her meet with our folks, of course, it just put to shame what we would describe as debate. I mean, this is a woman who could just, you know, stand up and just nail whatever it was. I mean, she was just remarkable, and I think he was very impressed with her. And, you know, there are people like that.
Did you also think part of it is generational, but he is of the generation that reveres the presidency?
Oh, no question. No question. I mean, it didn't matter. I mean, it does matter, but, you know, whether it was Bill Clinton or, you know, George Bush, there is it was interesting. During the budget negotiations, there were a number of times when we went down to the White House and we're in the cabinet room in discussions. And I'll never forget, we were sitting in the cabinet room. I was sitting right behind the boss, and he was at the table next to the president, next to Clinton. And a bunch of the Clinton staff were kind of rumbling around and kind of walking in and out of the Oval Office. I mean, just kind of walking in and walking out, and Clinton was sort of sitting at the table with us, and granted, this may have been an evening or a weekend meeting, I can't recall, but a couple of them, you know, were in like black t-shirts, and Dole sort of commented to me, "Never will this happen. You know, if I'm in this White House, it never would have happened if it were Ronald Reagan or George Bush." I mean, because to him, and I'm sure it wasn't intended, but to him it showed complete lack of respect for the individual and the office. That there is a protocol, there is a propriety about behavior and appearance. And I mean, you know, the President Clinton would be sitting at the table, and one of these guys would walk up and say something and, you know, walk into and, you know, Dole was sort of, you know, not that he was somebody who, you know, was unreasonably narrow or rigid in how he approached things. I mean, we all had, you know, conversations. I would walk into his office, but the degree with which, I mean, it was like it would never occur to me to call him Bob. You know, to this day, and I worked for the guy for 20 years, there's just a respect that one gives to the position in the office. And he was offended when that wasn't acknowledged. So there's no question to me, there's a respect and an acknowledgement of that office and the individual in that office. And frankly, Clinton, in a number of ways, you know, having given Dole the medal, after Dole had stepped down. I'll remember talking to Leon Panetta about that when Leon called and said, you know, what do you think Dole's reaction would be? I think Dole was enormously appreciative of that in many respects. But also because of his appreciation and acknowledgement of the office and the importance of the office and acknowledgement by the office. But it was an extraordinarily kind thing of Clinton to do. Well deserved, but remarkably kind. Very smart. No, he doesn't do anything without a calculated reason either. But I think it was an enormously good thing to do for someone who deserved it.
But I've heard Dole draw a distinction between Clinton, who he referred to as a likable rogue.
Yes.
And say, for example, his vice president.
Yes.
And
yes.
I mean, what was it about Clinton? Was it just kind of a sneaking admiration for someone who was so gifted?
I think A, that, B, Clinton was remarkably smart. I mean, just extraordinary mind, and very engaged in substance. And Dole always had enormous respect for that. He was always a little, Reagan had such a different approach to, sort of the cue cards when you go down to meet with the president, welcome to the White House, Senator. Not that Reagan wasn't gifted in many respects, but in a different kind of person. Clinton was gifted, and I think in part Dole was not envious, but certainly admired his facility with the public and his, the quivering chin. And so, Dole has respect for gifts, and Clinton was gifted in many respects. And he's a very gregarious person. I mean, they've done a number of things, obviously, since they both left office. And,
you think they become genuine friends?
I don't know that to be the case. I think they're certainly respectful of one another.
Yeah.
I don't know that I would describe them as friends.
Certainly not like, say, Ford and Carter became.
No, I don't think so. And I don't think they have occasion. I mean, they have a huge generational difference. But I think Dole was respectful and admired things about Clinton in terms of his skills. I think he also was, Dole has such a high moral trigger point that some aspects of the personal behavior, I think Dole found off-putting, shall we say.
One last thing, and we're going to need to try to schedule another session to do everything in between. But in some ways, would you agree that you could almost sum up both the essence of Dole, politically, in some ways personally, and the political challenges that he faced as the party in particular evolved when he said his hero was Dwight Eisenhower? If you stop to think of the qualities that Dwight Eisenhower represents to someone like a Bob Dole, it doesn't get better than that. I mean, just in terms of leadership, integrity, honor.
Exactly.
But Dwight Eisenhower is almost a man without a party in the current political climate.
Yes.
I'll never forget his son John once said to me, he said, moderates don't have cults. which is a very shrewd observation.
Good point.
And in some ways, Dole, if you look at the trajectory of Bob Dole's career, in '76 he was seen as this hardline conservative. But Jerry Ford was the most conservative president since Calvin Coolidge.
Right.
And over time, they came to be held as deeply suspect
by the
new conservatives.
Right.
For whom a Dwight Eisenhower is this kind of
anachronistic.
Yeah,
exactly. It wouldn't surprise me. In fact, I think it is in quite keeping with Dole in many respects that Eisenhower would, in fact, be the person to whom he would feel the most connection and hold in the highest regard. Not that he didn't hold other presidents in high regard, Jerry Ford being among them, but it is for all the reasons you described, which is unassailable ethical behavior and position, extraordinary commitment to country, extraordinary discipline as an individual. And in his personal and professional behavior. Now, he also is not exactly your charismatic, sort of leader. And in today's world, it would be, he couldn't compete against the Clinton, in many respects, or Reagan in terms of, the sort of popular, although, better than some, but it is generational, but I think some of those skills and some of those attributes go beyond the generation.
There's that wonderful iconic photo, which I never discussed with him, but it just, the picture of him
shaking hands.
And if you just look at what each man is wearing.
Yes.
It's sort of, there's just a little bit of country come to town.
Yes.
This
no question. No Gucci Gulch.
Freshman congressman
Right.
from
Yes.
the 6.
Yes.
You know?
With the president who just got out of uniform, bought his first suit.
Well,
yeah.
you know, but I mean, this is
Right.
it just there's this wonderful unspoken
Yeah,
message.
simple middle America.
Yeah.
Yeah, no question.
Yeah.
So it's, again, I think you could take that picture and move it forward 30 years, and my guess is the connection would be the same. Similar backgrounds, similar commitments to country, similar, perhaps in today's world, simplistic, commitment to the founding principles of the nation and to the office of the president. I don't think it would be any different today.
Almost more about values than policies.
No question. All about values. The policies would ebb and flow with the time, but it's all about individual characteristics and values.
One last thing, and then we'll wrap up. The press. I mean, I know it's a wide question. I mean, generally speaking, how did Dole get along with sort of both the establishment press, and he was around long enough to see kind of I mean, it's extraordinary when you think of, again, the trajectory of his career from the first time he ran for Congress.
Yes.
And took out a few newspaper ads.
Right.
And traveled around the district and talked to editors.
Right.
To
99,000 visits.
Jon Stewart and,
the Today Show.
And he clearly had an ability to adapt.
Yes.
And yet,
but not,
never seen as a natural.
No, never seen as a natural, but always sought as a guest.
Because of the authenticity, you think? Because they knew he wasn't a showman, he wouldn't put on a false
because he was always prepared to say something and engage. I think he was, very approachable. I think if you were to talk to, any one of these guys who spent a lot of time with him, whether it was on, the sort of Sunday talk shows where he was constantly there, with Meet the Press with Tim Russert or any of these guys, if you would talk with them, always engaging, always prepared to talk, always prepared to say something, not the sort of, avoidance of all things controversial, not shaken up by sort of a change in tone, not in, in his more recent years, hostile. I mean, just very approachable and entertaining, quick on his feet, and so, always kind of an engaged person who, you could see across the table and would connect with you. The writing press, he had a love-hate relationship, particularly with the New York Times, mostly the latter rather than the former, who I think gave him little credit for a lot of the work that he did, and were always suspicious of why he was doing something, and always sort of second-guessing him. The Wall Street Journal was kind of a mixed bag. Always questioned his conservatism, and always, around the tax issues and things of that nature. But
I'm curious, because what you're saying is he was seen as this establishment Republican,
absolutely.
but the establishment press wasn't buying.
No, they didn't, and I don't want to assume there was always a liberal bias, but I mean, there was, he had this love-hate relationship with David Rogers, who covered a lot of the appropriations and the budget stuff, and I think it was a kind of a personal thing. David was a Vietnam vet, and they always had sort of this odd sort of tension between them. But I don't think the press gave Dole the credit he deserved for many of the things that he did. We're always a little suspicious. It was always, he was just doing it for political reasons, and it was all partisan politics and the sort of biting, sort of wit. And I think showed little of the sort of personal side, really looked at why he did things. There were exceptions to that. I mean, there were folks, Bobby Horning and others, with whom he had a wonderful relationship.
He and David Brinkley were very good friends.
He and David Brinkley were good friends. He and Tom Brokaw got along very well, and I think Tom had remarkable respect for Dole, and Dole for Tom Brokaw in many respects. McNeil Lair, Jim Lair, I think it was Jim Lair, with whom he had a good relationship. So I think it varied. I think he found Woodward kind of interesting. We were always stunned at what Woodward can get people to say, and what we were always surprised at what we read. But I think he had a respect for somebody who was an aggressive investigative reporter and seemed to do remarkably well at getting people to talk about things. So I think he had a lot of respect for many of the individuals who covered him. But I think he didn't feel, there were a couple of people in particular at the times where he felt they really didn't give him fair due.
Do you think he misses it? Being asked to go on Meet the Press?
Yeah, I'm sure he must. I'm sure he misses being the player, and being in the middle of these decisions. Having said that, the guy's got more to do than God in terms of all the issues with which he's involved. But there's no question that when you've spent your life, and certainly his last years in the Senate, critical to everything that was going on, that transition's very hard. I think he misses a lot of the relationships, the camaraderie of just walking in. He was never happier than when he had 5 meetings going on. He'd have a group in my office, he'd have a group in his conference room, he'd have a group in his personal office, he'd have a group across in the hideaway, he'd have Simpson handling something else on the floor, and he was happiest kind of, going between all of those and kind of sticking his head in and, you got it fixed yet? And, you got it done? And, being in the middle of everything. And, walking across the aisle and walking down the hallway. He just reveled in that sort of engagement. Just as this most recent work that he's done on the Walter Reed issue. The people with whom I've spoken who worked with him on that said he just threw himself into it. For a lot of reasons, personal reasons included, but he loves that kind of engagement. So he can't help but miss it. But again, I think unlike a lot of them, he moved on. He's not...
He didn't go back, does he?
No, he doesn't. He's very cautious about going back, and I think respectful of the people who were there. And for the first year, stayed completely out of it, didn't do speeches, didn't do anything. In fact, one of his first was to come to the Kennedy School at Harvard, where I was executive dean at the time. And it was one of the few and early things that he did. He came up and gave a speech. And he really, for that first year, and even since then, in terms of going back to the Hill, doesn't do it. And I think it's having seen people that did. We'd all sit in the cloakroom, and some former member would rumble into the cloakroom. When the active members were sitting there engaged in something and want to sit down and chatter or, talk business, which Dole found wholly inappropriate. There's a line here. If you want to come and visit with me on a business matter and set up but to just kind of take advantage of your former position and kind of wander in and hang out, he found that wouldn't be comfortable for him. For some it is, for him it was not. And so I think he's been very respectful of the leadership in the Senate and their position and not trying to second guess. You don't hear him second guessing people. And I think he's been very respectful in that respect.
Can you ever imagine him retiring?
No. I can't. It's a frightening thought of him just sitting at home doing.
Maybe for Elizabeth too.
Dialing, I'm sure. For Elizabeth, I'm sure it's a frightening thought. I don't see it. Don't see it.
Yeah.